Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In a recent video, I shared how different papers foil. I tested out 14 different papers that I happen to have in my craft stash and just tested to see whether they would foil good, whether they would overfoil and whatnot. In today's video, I'm taking two of the pieces that I foiled in that video, and I'm going to do different techniques with alcohol inks. So the first one that I'm foiling here is heat-resistant acetate. So acetate is clear, but if you get regular acetate, it can't handle heat and it starts to warp. So you definitely need to use a heat-resistant acetate, something that's specially meant to be able to take a little bit of heat to do this technique. Now it foiled absolutely beautiful. There was a little bit of overfoiling and it couldn't be removed by the brush that I was using, but that's okay. Once this technique is done with the alcohol ink, you don't actually even notice it because it's kind of a busy-ish look and there's just so much to look at. So I've got my piece foiled here, put it to the side. Now it is acetate, it's completely clear. I have a piece of tissue behind it so that you can see it. Otherwise you'd only see pretty much the background. The second piece that I'm using is some alcohol ink cardstock, and I'm foiling that with a beautiful prism foil. Now, if you're not familiar with alcohol ink cardstock, it is a glossy cardstock, but it is a clay-coated cardstock. So it is porous, but it's perfect for alcohol inks, and they really, the colors really show well on it, and it looks absolutely beautiful. So this piece here, again, it foiled beautifully. I was really happy with how it foiled, and I had an idea of what I wanted to do with it. And this video, I'm playing around with that idea, hoping that it turns out, and it turned out how I was hoping it would. So there is a little bit of overfoiling there. I have a stiff brush here that I'm using just to remove some of that excess foil. So I've got those to the side. Now I'm going to play on them. I've got a piece of cardstock underneath, basically so that you can see what's happening on the acetate. These bottles that I'm using are squeeze bottles with a really fine tip to them, and I have about a quarter of my alcohol ink color, and then the rest of it is just isopropyl alcohol. I didn't want to spend a lot of time diluting my alcohol inks while I was working on them, and I also didn't want them to show up to be too dark basically and to cover the foiling. So by having it pre-mixed with some isopropyl alcohol, I can kind of control how much depth of color goes on. I can keep layering it to get some darker colors, and then I can just manipulate it by moving it around with my alcohol ink blower here. All of the supplies that I'm using for this project will be listed and linked down in the description box below. So if you're curious about anything, you can find the answers there. The colors I have in these bottles are ones that I like to use regularly, so I keep them mixed in the bottles. They have a nice stopper on them, so when I'm not using them, I can put the stopper on them. So I do have this sped up, and I'm just putting the colors where I want them to, and if I need to blow them out or have a little bit of control with blowing them out, I use my alcohol ink blower. Now, if you've ever worked with alcohol inks below or before, you have some control, but there's a limited amount of control that you have with them. I found that I was having a harder time controlling the alcohol inks on the acetate, and I wasn't sure if it was going to work out at one point, but in the end, I absolutely love how it turned out, and it's actually my daughter's favorite one. My favorite one is the one on the right with the alcohol ink cardstock, mainly because it turned out exactly how I had envisioned it. So I decided the white background was a little bit too stark for it, so I used an aqua color to color the background on both of them. And for the alcohol ink cardstock, this just allowed the greens and the reds to kind of naturally blend a little bit with them and create a bit of a softer look to them. It didn't happen that way with the acetate, but that's totally okay. It turned out different, but it also turned out really kind of cool. So you'll see with the acetate, the ink kind of tends to bunch up to itself and you get a lot more white space with it. So I was trying to fill in some of that white space, and once again, you have a certain amount of control with it, and the rest is just playing around with what alcohol ink does. You can use your alcohol ink blower to move it around. You'll see on my acetate here that I end up getting quite a few dark parts at points. So I'll take just a piece of paper towel or a piece of napkin and I'll lift those up. If at any point something is way too dark, you can also use just plain isopropyl alcohol to rehydrate that ink and to move it around a little bit more. So I do, in between different areas, let it dry out a little bit, just so that I can see what it's doing. If you only add alcohol ink while it's wet, it just keeps pooling out and spreading out, and you have less control over it. I also use the blue for the outer edge, just to kind of hold everything in, just to kind of move it back to the foiled image. The one thing to pay attention to with these fine tipped bottles is they have a metal tip to them, and sometimes when I'm using them, I'm kind of rubbing on the alcohol ink cardstock in particular, and it does scratch the alcohol ink cardstock. So something to be aware of. If you don't want it to do that, make sure not to actually touch the alcohol ink cardstock. So I'm going back in on my acetate with the different colors that I want, just building up that ink color. Like I said, the one thing between the two of them, so the alcohol ink cardstock, I'm working on the right side, and I'm working on the side of the cardstock that was foiled. When it gets foiled through a Big Shot machine, it doesn't add a lot of texture to it, but there is definitely a little bit of an indent where it's foiled, where it's pressed that foil into the cardstock. And because the transparency of the acetate, I'm working on the opposite side, I don't have that little bit of a well in there. So for the alcohol ink cardstock, it kind of would hold the color in a little bit where I wanted it to go. Not totally, obviously, because you can see it's gone over the lines, but it kept where it was in the different areas a little bit better than the acetate, and that's because the acetate doesn't have any of those lines. I'm working on just a flat sheet of acetate. So I'm at the point where I kind of had all the reds and greens concentrated to the center of the acetate, and I'm trying to move them around because I didn't really want it to be just a plain line. The great thing with alcohol inks is, even though you don't have a lot of control, you can keep adding more to them and deepening colors. But if you find that you have too much, you can just lift it off. The alcohol ink blower helps to move it around where you want it to go and control it just a little bit. So I've got my pieces done. I'm set them to the side to dry, and I know that I want to have some sentiments for my cards, but I don't really know what I want them to be yet. So I have this sentiment set from Spellbinders. It's got 5 different sentiments, so it's got 5 different foiling plates, and then it also has the dies to cut those sentiments out. One of my pieces has gold foil on it, one has a silver prism foil on it. So I'm going to do all 5 of those sentiments, but I'm also going to do I'm going to do them in gold, and I'm also going to do them in the prism color. And then off screen, I'm going to do them as well with my solid hot foiling plate, so that I have the negative part of the foil used up, and I will have these cut out and just have them ready for future projects. That way it's all done. You might as well do it all at once. So you'll notice my cardstock is a lot bigger than it really needs to be, and that's because I wanted to make sure that these sentiments were spread around enough so that I had enough room to cut them out with the dies. You don't want to have the sentiments too close to each other, because you might cut into an area that you need to cut out with another die, so best to have them spread out a little bit. So I've got my gold one done there, and now I'm doing my silver prism one. Now I did get a little bit of overfoiling. The one thing, my Glimmer machine is new, so it's really stiff in the plug on there. And I find sometimes when I pull it out, the pieces skip a little bit. And sometimes it makes a difference and sometimes it doesn't. If you have some overfoiling, you can use a sand eraser to help remove areas that you don't want. Just be aware that that sand eraser is also going to affect the finish of the foil that you do want. So be careful not to use it over top of something that you want to keep, because it's going to dull the finish of it. So I've got my dies here. I'm just cutting them out. You'll notice I didn't cut all 5 of them at once because the dies got too close to each other, and I didn't want them to be on top of each other while they were die cutting. So it's not a big deal to do it in 2 parts, just to make sure that the dies don't get ruined. Here I'm using that sand eraser just to remove a little bit of overfoiling on this particular piece here. A lot of this overfoiling is probably stuff that wouldn't necessarily be noticed by someone that didn't really know, or didn't really know how the die was or is supposed to look. So I've got my pieces already. I've chosen which sentiments I want to use, and I'm just going to start assembling my card. Now that red oval on the card to the right, I just took 2 nesting ovals and put them on the cardstock that I was going to use, taped them a distance apart so that I knew that they would stay where I wanted them to while I was cutting. And then I cut it out just to do an oval frame. I just thought it helped to frame the acetate piece a little bit better. And I didn't want to put that red behind it because that's going to affect all of the colors. So just having a little oval on top is the perfect way to do it. It just frames the whole piece and just kind of makes it, it just kind of finishes it. So the piece on the left here that I'm gluing together is my alcohol ink cardstock background piece, and I'm just doing a nice simple matting and layering on the card, and then I'm going to put my sentiment on there. As always, I like to put an acrylic block over things while they're drying, just so the I don't have to sit there and hold it. Sometimes with liquid adhesive, the cardstock tries to warp a little bit, and by having something over top of it, it keeps everything flat, makes sure that it doesn't move, and it frees up my hands to work on something else. So I'm going to let that dry there while I'm assembling my acetate pieced card. I already have a piece of cardstock that's the same size as my card front, and I've got an oval cut out of it. I did this off screen because I was trying to decide how I wanted to put this card together. When I originally had this card in my head, I was going to do kind of a stained glass window thing where you could see through it, but looking at this piece without some white behind it, it looks a little bit strange and you can't really see the lines of the flower. So it looks a lot better having a piece of white cardstock behind it, which is going to end up being the card base. And it just makes it look a lot nicer. So sometimes, even though you have one idea in your head, you need to change it up mid-project, and that's totally okay. So I'm using some double-sided adhesive here. I like using this adhesive because it's nice and strong and it holds things together really well. I could put, or I could use my Distress Collage medium and use a liquid adhesive for this, but the double-sided tape is going to work a lot quicker. So to make sure that front goes nicely on the front of the card and straight, I just put the edge of the card as well as that edge of the front onto my mat to line things up. That way I knew that edge was completely lined up, and then it just made it easier to have everything in place. You could also do this inside a stamp positioner, that works as well. And then I'm taking my Distress Collage medium, put it on the back of that oval, and I will place that onto the front of my card. Definitely prefer liquid adhesive for this because I can control where it goes and move it if it just goes a little bit out of place. Much easier to place things that way. Once it is all ready and placed properly, I'm going to put my acrylic block on there, let that dry for a few minutes, and then put my adhesive on the back of my sentiment. Now this particular sentiment, the last part of that birthday, the little swirl, didn't get foiled, and I think it was it either didn't get pressure or maybe the foil was there, the edge of the foil was there. But in order to make that not look weird, I'm having that edge a little bit off of the card, and I will snip it off once it is completely dry. You'll never notice that that piece wasn't foiled. Now, I didn't add any extra dimension to these cards because I didn't feel it was needed, but you certainly could cut the sentiment a few times and put it underneath, or put some foam pop dots behind there if you wanted some dimension. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a fabulous day.